Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vangen, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on leadership challenges and opportunities in the Black, Asian and minority ethnic voluntary sector this afternoon. So before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to introduce briefly the Open University and the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership and what we do in the center, CVSL. So this webinar is hosted by the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership in the Faculty of Business and Law at the Open University. And the Open University, as some of you may know, offers flexible, innovative, online teaching and world-leading research across the UK and in 157 countries worldwide. The Open University's mission is to be open to people, places, methods and ideas. And so we offer access to university education to anyone, anywhere, regardless of specific backgrounds and needs. If you want to find out more about learning with the Open University, then please visit us on www.open.ac.uk. So the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, or CVSL, is a centre in the business school, which is closely related to the OU's social mission, and which focuses on offering expertise in leadership development and inter-organisational collaboration that is particularly relevant to the voluntary sector. My own contribution to CVSL is based primarily on my research, which spans more than 2 decades, and which is about governing, leading and managing across organisational boundaries. So my research has led to the development of the theory of collaborative advantage. Collaborative advantage is the idea that organisations can work together to achieve something that none of them can achieve on their own. But the ability to create that advantage, or synergy, if you like, rests essentially on enabling partners with different areas of expertise, assets, know-how, priorities, cultures and values to work together effectively. And those of you who have experience of working collaboratively with individuals in other organisations will know that this can be far from trivial in practice. So my research and the theory of collaborative advantage is about understanding what the challenges are and how these may be addressed in practice. Again, if you would like to know more, please get in touch with us via the CVSL webpage, or you can email us directly. Okay, so my colleagues and I have worked collaboratively to develop CVSL and to provide specific resources that you might find helpful. We would like to draw your attention to 2 online leadership courses that were authored by my colleagues, Owain Smolovic-Jones and Carol Jacqueline Jarvis, and which are about leadership development and which are free for anyone to access. These courses are called Introducing Leadership in the Voluntary Sector and Collaborative Leadership in the Voluntary Sector. You may have something very specific in mind when you think about leaders and leadership, and indeed this may be positive or not so positive depending on what in particular comes to mind. In CVSL and in developing these particular courses, we are not thinking about leadership as being associated with the individual hero leader, the one who is at the top of an organisation, for example. But rather we see leadership as being about making things happen. We see leadership as something that is shared, possibly collaborative, and where a range of individuals collectively make a difference to an organisation or the sector as a whole. So in developing the courses such as the 2 that I've just mentioned, we try to work with the sector, with individual stakeholders and organisations, many of whom have very specific expertise to share. And we learn from this and we try to figure out what the particular issues and challenges might be and what we in CVSL can do to help address those issues and challenges. So that brings me to introducing the participants in today's webinar, all of who will address experiences of being a leader in the BAME voluntary sector, opportunities for leadership development in this sector, their experiences of collaborating with others across voluntary, public and private institutions, and specific leadership challenges faced by leaders of BAME voluntary sector organisations. So the first speaker is Fedilis Chibe, and I'll introduce Fedilis first. And then once Fedilis has finished his presentation, we'll have a conversation between Gilly Green and Joseph Jeffers. And finally, my colleague Fidela Mutvarabitso will host a sort of a question and answer session. So Fedilis is the founder and director of Migrant Action. Fedilis also served as the Operations and Development Manager or Deputy CEO for RETAS, that's Refugee Education Training Advice Services. Fedilis holds an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies and a PhD in Advanced Conflict Transformation. He is involved in activities aimed at promoting peace, social change, and humanitarianism. He is a member of the Leadership Development in the Migration Sector Advisory Group, coordinated by Migration Exchange. So I will now hand you over to Fedilis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that wonderful introduction, and thank the university for organizing this webinar on a very important subject, and which is coming up increasingly as something that we need to seriously engage with. And also thanks to everyone who is participating in this webinar for making the time to do so. I want to start my presentation with a very simple quote. It reads, since inequalities still exist in our society, there is a need for a sector that challenges that and seeks to address it through the services, the campaigning, the voice that it puts forward. And I think if the sector wasn't there, that the voice would not be heard anywhere and it would be absorbed or diluted by other agendas. The reason why I started with this quote is because most often when we talk about leadership in the BAME sector, it is not new. We've had these conversations going back decades, but we don't seem to be making much progress in my view because we often skirt around the grave conversation, which is about race inequality. And any conversation about leadership gap in the sector or the challenges that we encounter that does not engage genuinely with the issue of racial inequality, but focuses somehow on the operational issues around collaboration and networking and training, which are all very important, but still doesn't actively challenge the dynamics of racial inequality and the mindsets that emanate from that. We'll be back here in 10 years' time talking about the same issue, but maybe a little bit more nuanced. So I think talking about leadership challenges within the BME sector, we have an entrenchment of racial inequality and a mindset which often doesn't quite see that people from BME backgrounds often naturally have the capacity and the agency and the ability to become leaders. And I think that's something that we need to challenge very, very strongly. And I have my lived experience of this as a leader within the sector, which often when I started becoming responsible in leadership positions, it always wasn't seen to be that this was something that I could do. And so this is largely underpinned by these mindsets about our inability to be able to be good leaders. Another challenge which I think we need to also look at is what I've described as the poverty of leadership development. Most organizations in the sector don't prioritize leadership development. And this is primarily because they often operate with very small budgets and they are running on very short-term basis that don't often focus elaborate governance and sustainability architecture that allows for leadership development. So leadership is not often a strategic priority for most BME organizations, as they are often concerned with resolving emergency and crisis situations that present at their doorsteps. So this poverty of leadership development in this sector is a major challenge. And I'm a living testimony where I have battled my way to leadership positions by self-funding my leadership development or securing additional support through networks and partnerships such as Paul Hamlin, Oasis, and other strategic partners. And this is a very important point for us to consider, because in this sector, most organizations, as I say, don't have those huge budgets where strategic thinking and development of leadership is something that preoccupies them. And this is a major challenge because we are not producing leaders within the sector because that investment is not there. So that, again, is a major challenge. And again, based on my experience of this, I have worked in so many organizations where that's not been talked about. People just have to find for themselves which way or which options they can explore to be able to make that progression to develop. And that's something that we need to invest a bit more. Another challenge, again, in the sector when it comes to leadership development is a burden, what I've described as a burden of lived experience. It is often the case that that seems to be the currency that most people within the sector have as their way into these sort of wider discourses. I have been in conferences where when it comes to the analysis or to the solutions or to shaping decision making, I don't occupy that space. But when it comes to giving my lived experience, that's where I become relevant. And I think that burden of lived experience is something which really makes leadership development a challenge in the sector. And so most people within the BME sector often find their relevance largely around providing experience of their situations based on their lived experience, rather than being responsible for shaping decisions and developing new forms of thinking. So one way that we need to be able to challenge that is to ensure that we don't, people within the BME sector, their relevance is not located solely when it comes to sharing their lived experience or informing the discourse. It's about being able to shape those decisions and take responsibility for making them. Another challenge, which obviously it's something you've mentioned already in your introduction, is poor networking and collaboration. And this is partly because most often small organizations within the sector are often scrambling for crumbs because they are having to compete rather than pulling those resources together. And this obviously makes it very difficult for collaboration and for networking. But again, I think there are signs that this is beginning to change. I think one of the things that austerity, in an ironical way, has done is it means that because there's fewer resources around, people are beginning to think, how can we pull together these limited resources and work together and get to know how we join the dots rather than working in silos. But this is a major challenge for leadership within the sector because people still very much work in silos rather than working collaboratively. Bringing those energies together, synergizing, is something that we need to do more. I also identify that within the BME sector, the trickle down doesn't quite happen. And what I mean by that is leadership development opportunities usually stay at the top. And that's because we have the senior managers leading these processes. They are the natural ones to occupy that space. What we should be doing is how do we make sure that those opportunities trickle down to frontline staff and have a much more distributive approach to leadership, which means that we have organizations that are becoming more resilient and leadership that is becoming more sustainable. But that's not quite happening within the sector because, again, the resources are quite limited. When those resources come around, they can only be taken up by senior managers. And that makes it very difficult for leadership development to take root within the sector. There's also the issue of what I've described as crushed hopes. And what I mean by that is, again, sometimes when people have made that stride to get into leadership positions within the sector, there is often the fact that people experience difficulties in how they are viewed. The support is not often there. And sometimes that motivation to sustain their engagement as leaders begins to wane. And some form of self-doubt creeps in. And because of that, you have fewer people taking up the challenge to become leaders in the sector. So that sense of crushed hope is a real challenge because we're having fewer role models within the sector that are taking up leadership positions and providing this sort of inspiration for future leaders to come up. However, having said that, I think that's beginning to change. We're having more people who are braving the challenge to step up and become leaders. So that takes me to opportunities. What are the opportunities that we are experiencing within the sector when it comes to leadership? The landscape is changing, and I have to say that, because there's a growing realization at the sector that leadership diversity is good for the organization, as it brings different skills and experiences and knowledge, which enriches the organization. There's a new interest in leadership development within the statutory sector for people from BME background. So I think that realization is something which offers new opportunities for organizations to think proactively about diversifying leadership. We're also having an increasing number of BME voices articulating the problem of BME leadership and advocating solutions. This didn't used to be the case. I think there's a more awakening now about the importance of really articulating the leadership gap that exists within the sector. And the more we have this, there's a prospect that we have more organizations coming up to take some responsibility to provide leadership development opportunities within the organizations. There is more networking and collaboration amongst BME organizations in the sector for leadership development as resources can be pulled together. Again, from my experience as operations manager and director of Migrant Action, we are doing a bit more now than we used to do in terms of working together as organizations and exploring those gaps and sharing that knowledge, which is very peer-led, and that is helping organizations to strengthen their leadership and expand opportunities. We're also finding that there's new forms of power. And I think this is very important. Those traditional spaces where leadership used to operate is beginning to change. The internet is radically changing and creating new opportunities where people don't need to find themselves in large organizations or in fixed organizations. You can create an organization and engage audiences online. And I think that is also bringing new opportunities for leadership. And those new forms of power, I think, is really, really good for BME organizations to take hold of and explore more opportunities to be able to support and encourage young leaders that are emerging and to pool those resources together. There is also an increasing interest by funders and other institutions, including the Open University, in resulting in more initiatives for leadership development that aim at reducing leadership inequalities for BME, the BME voluntary sector. An example of this, which is something that I'm involved in as part of the advisory group, is an initiative which is now being coordinated by Migration Exchange, which is aiming to be able to bring together 100 individuals, 50 of them from BME backgrounds, to involve and engage in a leadership development program. That is quite important because without those sort of initiatives, it becomes very difficult for BME organizations or people from BME backgrounds to be able to access those opportunities. And I think this interest in funders, in organizations and institutions to engage in the dialogue or the discourse about leadership development, but also put together resources to support its development is really, really important. And I think, obviously, I'm mindful of the time that I've been allocated to for the webinar. But I think just to put that in conclusion, I think more really needs to be done to drive leadership development in the BME sector. However, I go back to where I started. If we don't engage in those very systemic structural barriers that are making it very difficult for leadership to thrive in the voluntary sector, and we somehow skirt around the edges and we talk about some of those operational things, which are in themselves quite useful in terms of training, in terms of collaboration, in terms of networking, that's all good. But all of that needs to operate within a space where there's a recognition that we still have entrenched racial inequality, which is creating a mindset which really makes it very difficult for people from BME backgrounds to be naturally seen as having the agency and the skills and the potential to be fantastic leaders and therefore be supported to grow and thrive in that space. If we engage in those systemic and structural mindset change and culture change aspects, then we begin to have real hope that these sort of initiatives, which the Open University and many other organizations are engaging in providing resources to enable leadership development to thrive, will then begin to take root. If we don't do that, my view will be slightly less hopeful, because those systemic and structural underpinnings really do matter for us to make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Fedilis. And I'm sure there are many people in the audience who would like to delve in and ask you lots of questions about that already. But before we open up to the question and answer, we will allow Gilly and Joseph to have a conversation. So let me just briefly introduce our two conversationists then. So Gilly Green has worked in the community and voluntary sector for over 35 years, initially in the housing and homelessness field through girls' work and violence against women, and then moved into grant making, where she was head of UK grant at Comic Relief until 2018. Her interests lie in connecting people and creating partnerships, organizational development, and ensuring the inclusion of those who are often marginalized. She's currently a freelance consultant for the King's Fund, where she oversees the Cascading Leadership Program and also works for a number of trusts and foundations on grant-making strategy and policy. Gilly is currently a trustee of a small startup aiming to provide the first LGBT plus older people's housing community in London, and Rosa, the Women's Fund on grant-making, supporting women and girls around justice and equality. Joseph Jeffers joined ASCII, so Advice, Support, Knowledge, Information, as Chief Executive in 2015. He has spent a number of years working in the voluntary sector, and Joseph now divides his time between ASCII and working as an independent consultant, working with BME groups across London and parts of the Midlands and Leeds. Joseph is committed to increasing the visibility of older people and their views on race and social issues. So over to you, Gilly and Joseph.
Okay, thanks very much, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for inviting myself and Joseph to share some thoughts with you. For the next sort of 10 minutes or so, Joseph and I are going to have a conversation which very much comes from Joseph's own experience, and he will talk about his journey to becoming a leader of an organisation, and we will weave into that, I think, some of the issues certainly that Fedilis mentioned. Very similar stuff coming up, but this is very much a conversation really that starts with the personal experience, and from there we hope that we can extrapolate and find relevance into the broader debate. And then we'll also I'll take a moment to talk a little bit about the Cascading Leadership Program, which we're currently recruiting for, and some of the people who are on the webinar might well be interested in, so we'll cover that as well. So just to begin, really, I was going to just ask Joseph, really, can you tell us a bit about yourself, Joseph, who you work for, and just your journey, really, to becoming the chief exec that you now are today?
Sure. So my name is Joseph Jeffers, and I'm the CEO of a charity called ASCII, which is actually based in Croydon, an area of quite high deprivation, and I've been doing that since 2015. I've worked in the voluntary sector in a range of roles for approximately 25 years, working with young people, older people, managing volunteer teams. So I've had a broad experience of the voluntary sector. And my long-term goal was always to actually lead an organization. But over the years, I realized that for a range of reasons, those opportunities weren't coming my way. And when they did come my way, often at interview stage, I was very concerned about why the organization wanted me. Did they actually want to have a black face in the organization, or were they really looking to have my experience and skills? And so I decided to actually establish ASCII because I felt that was one way of making sure that I could actually deliver what I actually wanted within the community.
I mean, that's a very interesting journey, Joseph, and I think, we often talk about a sense that you need to be able to see success to believe in it. And I think we've heard from Fedilis and our own experience that, there aren't an awful lot of BAME roles that can encourage others in starting out, to believe that, it is a truly diverse and inclusive environment which will welcome you and build, your career. So I suppose, and just that, thinking about that leap you made, I just wonder what or who did you see that sort of inspired you or gave you confidence that you were going to go for that goal? Do you have stuff to share there?
I mean, I think that comes in many ways from my parents giving me a sense of self-belief, because I remember at school back in the 70s where my peers were being encouraged to do academic work. My school teachers at that stage were trying to encourage me to go into sports and music. And my parents actually said absolutely not. There are things you can have as a hobby, but basically you need to get a sound education. So I think self-belief started at a very early age. I'm definitely a person that actually likes challenges. But in some ways, after a while, those challenges can actually become burdens. And I've seen many bright stars from the BAME community within the voluntary sector who have actually burnt out by actually trying to bring about change and it not happening. I also sort of think that one of the things that's very, very important for me has actually been to make networks in many ways outside of the sector, because the fact that there are so few people from BAME backgrounds leading organizations, there sometimes can also be an element of a challenge between 2 or 3 people from BAME organizations who are actually, chief executives. And rather than sometimes support each other, we were actually set up in a way that we competed against each other. And I think that's something that, having grown and developed my leadership style, I'm actually more happy to work in a collaborative way with other CEOs and share my experiences.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you talk about some of that kind of potential competition and stuff, but just broadening that out a little bit, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your experience of kind of being in this leadership role within the BAME sector, and what's that been like?
It's been exciting, but it also had a range of challenges. The challenges range from going to conferences or meetings and being the only person from a BAME background. That in itself can be very isolating, and also often you find that you are actually somehow expected to talk on behalf of the whole BAME community, which clearly you can't. I think there's also the idea that you're actually trying to constantly prove yourselves and trying to have to go that extra mile compared to other people, because you obviously want to keep that seat at the table. And the fact that often there's unrealistic demands of you that are not placed on others. I think that for me as a BME, a chief executive, getting around the table where I can actually meet the appropriate often funders and actually get opportunities for development, as Fidel said, can be quite difficult, because with small charities, often many, many years ago, training and development was seen as something very positive, whereas now, if you talk to trustees about going on training, their concern is what's going to happen to the organization whilst you are away. And I think it's also sometimes very hard to be heard. I've been to lots of conferences and meetings where basically you go around a table, you give an idea, and it's ignored, and basically at the end you find someone from non-BME group will actually say exactly what you said, and everyone thinks it's a wonderful idea, and let's go with that. And I think everyone wants, I also sometimes feel personally that everyone wants a bit of view in order to boost their access to minority communities. So often you're invited along because maybe they've got some funding and which to work with BME communities, but basically they don't know how to reach those communities and want to use you to actually do that for them, not in a collaborative way, and bringing no financial gain back to ASCII as a charity.
And Joseph, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of those things, really. I mean, you talk about that thing about, everybody wants a bit of you to boost their own sort of access. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about collaboration and the need to be in partnerships and have, the desire for those partnerships to be equal. Mm. And I think some of what you're saying is suggesting really that hasn't been the case with the way that you've been, that you've worked with those other organisations. And I just wonder, in your sense, is that right? Does that feel like that? But also, what would make it more equal? Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of those things where you think to yourself, no matter how much training, education, no matter how good your track record is, unless basically the people you're inviting you to the table are going to want to see you as an equal partner, it never really works out. And one of the things that sometimes concerns me is that these invitations to be involved in partnerships is often centered around funding, where once again you actually have a group of people that the partnership would actually like to reach and can't. And so that's where the conversation would start from, whereas good partnership working would mean that basically they will develop an engagement, a relationship with us as a charity or BME charities. So that way, when they actually call you to take part in some form of collaboration or partnership, you actually then don't feel as if there's a hidden agenda. I've been in a number of partnerships where it started off really great, and then when it comes time to maybe meet the funder or meet the local authority, all of a sudden, because you're a smaller organisation, it's been decided that you don't need to come to those meetings. But at those meetings, those key meetings, is when the funding is decided, the strategy is decided, and you're not able to shape it. And for me, as a chief executive, one of the things I want to do, apart from looking to try and actually find money to run our services, is to help shape the strategy and giving people from being older people a voice within the sector.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, very much, that need to be at the table, to have your voice heard, to not feel like you're there in a tokenistic way. Do you see any signs of change on the horizon? What would make it easier for others to succeed in these roles?
I think it is getting a bit better. I think we are now seeing organisations making the effort to involve a wider group of people around the table to have discussions. At this stage, I'm not convinced it's equal, but it's actually a start. And it's about people like myself and others, a bit like Fidel said, actually starting to form informal partnerships, getting people to actually gather. We also do a lot of work now with linking in with business and outside of the charity sector, because there you can find people who can become your advocates and who can actually support you in terms of breaking down some of those barriers.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, I mean, Joseph, with regard to leadership development and opportunities for development, you've been on the leadership programme, the Cascading Leadership Programme at the King's Fund, and I'd like to ask you just a bit about your experience of that. But before I do that, perhaps it's just useful for me to explain very briefly to the assembled audience just what the programme is, so that people can relate to it. So, Cascading Leadership is founded very much on the premise of two things, really. that thoughtful and reflective leadership increases the effectiveness of organisations. But importantly, the sector, the voluntary sector itself, has the skills within it to develop strong leaders. And so the model of cascading leadership is based on a peer-to-peer model, and it is for organisations that work within the health and well-being sectors, but we define that very, very broadly. It essentially is a scheme that really enables new or emerging leaders who we call partners to grow and find their own solutions with support from fellow CEOs from within the sector, who we call consultants. And the consultants get trained by the King's Fund, and they in turn gain valuable coaching skills and get challenged in their own development, which in turn I think they can take that back into their own organisations. So how does it work? Well, during the programme, a partner and a consultant are matched together. They meet at least 5 times over a period of about 9 months. And during that time, the partner's got a chance to work through issues that they have decided they would like some support with. And the consultant, meanwhile, will be supervised by the King's Fund to ensure a quality offer. There's no charge for the course at all. It's free for the training, travel, accommodation where needed. And basically, just to sum up, I think it's distinctive in that people who are providing the support to other VCS organisations are themselves leaders in the sector, current leaders in the sector, so they understand some of the challenges that are going on. And I think just wanted to say finally that the course is open to small and medium-sized voluntary sector organisations. I suppose, given what we've heard, both from Fedilis and from Joseph, we have not attracted as many consultants or partners from BAME organisations as we'd like to, and so we'd very much like organisations, if they're interested, to get in touch and think about whether it's something for them. And so just very briefly, in the few final words I want to give to Joseph, to ask him what he got from being on the programme.
For me, it was a great opportunity. It's made me a lot more reflective. Going through the process, I was a little bit fearful at first. It wasn't going to be a standard kind of leadership course that I'd maybe have done before, and it wasn't. I found it challenging. The person who I got matched with kind of got me as a person, and she was also from a BME background and managed a very large organization, and for me was able to give me a whole range of skills and ways of actually kind of thinking. And it also gave me an opportunity to develop myself as a person. It gave me that reflective time, and a lot of the actual what I got out of that is now being embedded within ASCII as a charity and with other colleagues within the voluntary sector that I'm actually coming across. As a result of taking part in the course, I was able to persuade my board to actually, jump in, and we've actually set up a social enterprise as an arm of our charity. And also about about maybe 3 or 4 months ago, we also picked up our first CCG contract, and I think that's primarily because I realised that basically, having set up the organisation, I have to actually not wait for somebody to support me. Those opportunities that are there, I have to go out and actually take them. So I'll be ever grateful for the King's Fund and the Cascading Leadership Programme. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you for that, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's my turn now to open up a forum and get people to talk and discuss. We have had some interactions from the audience. What I'm going to do is, while we give a chance to everybody to to ask their questions, and then we try to sum them up and ask Joseph, Gilly, and Fedilis to answer them. I would like to start by thanking everybody for making their contribution and giving us some food for thought. So we'll be listening in carefully to what was said and seeing what implications the ideas shared will have on the work of CVSL as we shape our future in the coming weeks and months. So what we'll do is we'll be asking, speakers to respond individually so that you don't get everybody to jump to answer the questions at once. Maybe I start with Fedilis, because it's a while since you are on the mic. Nina did ask you a question here, which is going like this. On the back of what you said about systemic inequality, there's this whole idea of decolonizing our mindset in the voluntary sector. And apparently, I didn't know this, but there was this Charity So White campaign some weeks back. So what do you think about that campaign, if you heard about it, or more importantly, how do you think we can go about decolonizing minds of people in the voluntary sector in general? Fedilis.
Thank you. That's a difficult question. In the sense, first of all, I am not aware of the campaign. So I'm not quite sure I can comment authoritatively on what the objective of the campaign was. But to the question around how do we address the systemic challenge, which I hinted, which again Joseph articulated it brilliantly in his input. First of all, the voluntary sector kind of mirrors the wider society. So it doesn't stand somewhere on its own. It reflects the wider picture. And I think when I was referring to the systemic inequality is that we're still very much within a space where there is the racialization of migration. And what I mean by that is that there is so much that is still being viewed in terms of BME communities or the BME voluntary sector, that individuals that operate within that space, again, as Joseph said quite very clearly, it's not their natural position to become leaders. And when they do, they have to come under extra scrutiny. And when you do, you kind of stand up. You have to prove yourself even more. And when it comes to that point where the strategies are being shaped or the decision making is being done, you kind of not really be involved because you're not often viewed to have much to bring to the table. These are mindsets, these are views that are very intrinsic to the perception about race and race equality. So for me, the issue there is how do we, first of all, very honestly and openly acknowledge that that is something for us to tackle, to own it. Organizationally, we have to have organizational cultures that reflect on unconscious bias and enable leadership to think in a way which addresses that inequality and empowers people from BME communities to be able to not empower people from BME communities, sorry, but to empower people from non-BME communities to be able to understand that people from BME communities in the voluntary sector have the agency, they have the skills, they have the ambition, and they have the talent to be able to rise as leaders. So this is something about cultural shift in our mindset, in our thinking. And those conversations don't really need to be happening around the corridors or around the fringe of how organizations operate. Those conversations have to move into the mainstream in talking about it openly and making sure that we confront them. Now, there are ways that we can do that practically. Again, as I mentioned, I think processes like what Migration Exchange is doing to have some sort of, not positive, people can describe as positive discrimination, but opening up more opportunities, directly engaging with those communities and opening up spaces for people to access more, we should do. The challenge of expecting that people from BAME communities will find their way to those opportunities, rather those opportunities should find a way of accessing those communities. So it has to be coming down rather than expect people to move up, because it's often very difficult, again, something that Joseph mentioned, to have the confidence and the self-esteem and the aptitude to be able to brave that journey. So I think these are some of the things that we need to consider more to be able to address more of those entrenched systemic barriers when it comes to leadership development. But again, as I said earlier, it's not something that we can just skirt around. We have to name it, and we have to find a way of bringing those conversations into the open and really see how we shape behaviors and thinking within leadership circles to engage with that.
Thank you, Fedilis, because I still have a few people who have asked questions. We are trying to go through as many as possible. So next I turn to Gilly and Joseph. I am going to refer to a question from Ian. So there is an issue around leadership development within the voluntary sector in general. And also we have heard about the specific needs of the BAME voluntary sector. So, Gilly and Joseph, should we have different tracks, or should we have an overall track of leadership development in the voluntary sector, but which is conscious of the disadvantages faced by the BAME voluntary sector? Joseph and Gilly?
Sorry, it's Joseph. I mean, I suppose in an equal setting, what would actually happen is equality would actually be going through the framework of all training, and therefore potentially it shouldn't really matter. However, the reality is that people from BME backgrounds who are chief executives or aiming to become chief executive are kind of starved in a few hurdles kind of back, really. And as we've talked about, many of the issues that we actually have to overcome is about that constant being told that we're not going to be good enough, we can't achieve it. And then if you do get to the stage where you become a chief executive, not only have you got extra scrutiny from external, but also for within your own community, there's a question kind of why do you actually kind of want to actually do it in the first place? What's in it for you? So I think training and development, I mean, I started in the voluntary sector 25 years ago. I think then when you started in work, having a training budget was actually kind of quite common, whereas now people actually getting training for free is very unheard of. And when training, good quality training sometimes is available, it's very, very expensive. Or when there's other training that comes up, often people from BME communities, myself included, think, well, this isn't going to be right for me, because when you look at the delegate list, you think we're not going to have anything in common. So I think anything that basically supports people from BME communities to actually realize they do deserve a place at that table. They actually have got the experience, but it's more about being given the opportunity to be around the table, because the reality is you can have all the actual skills in the world. If you're going for an interview to be a chief executive and there's nobody on the other side of the table that mirrors or reflects you, and they don't get you, the chances are you're not going to be hired, because I think statistics basically people actually hire people that either look like them or sound like them or have the same class. I mean, I don't know whether Gilly wants to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I think that's really, really helpful, and I suppose, you know, in a way, I mean, it goes back to just as I think we were talking before about, you know, the need for a kind of a shift in culture within organisations. It's the same with delivering a training program. You know, I think we have to recognise the dynamics that people bring into the room. We have to find a way that people's contributions have equal value, and that we make sure in that way that we're offering something that everybody feels that their contribution is valued, and that we take sort of practical actions to ensure that, you know, that can happen. But I think, Joseph, you've answered that question, you know, really very well, and I haven't got anything else to add particularly.
Thank you very much. And then we move to Jessica's question here, which is looking at intersectionality and what the challenges it poses in terms of aspiring BAME leaders, for example, in relation to gender, class, and so forth. I think we've heard it often said that sometimes we have got the so-called one-man show organization. So, I mean, how do we reflect on those issues within leadership in the BME sector? That's the question I'm going to pose to. I'll start with Fedilis, and maybe just be very brief, and then we'll go to Joseph. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
So the question is the intersectionality of leadership within the BME sector. So in other words, what about, female leaders? What about people who are not necessarily highly educated? What about those people who come from smaller communities and so forth? So do we think the leadership within the sector is representative of all of the above?
Okay. At the moment, I don't think so. And it goes back to something I said earlier, and Joseph articulated again. I think equality as a framework, but in practice, we need to do better. The issue at the moment with the BME sector is the leadership structure is still very much defined by the individuals who have the access to those positions. And once they're there, it becomes very difficult for that shift to happen. What we should be doing is having a much more distributive leadership model or leadership development, which cascades leadership opportunities across the board, across the organization. And we should be having organizations and structures which ensure that leadership is not about the CEO or the operations manager. It is about the volunteer coordinator. It is about the frontline worker. It is about auxiliary staff. People having responsibility to bring to the table to ensure that the organization functions well. It doesn't matter whether your gender shouldn't really count, or the level of education. So I think at the moment within the BME sector, we still have a lot of work to do.
Are we turn to Joseph?
I think I definitely agree with that. There's a lot of work needed because, for instance, you could argue that, great to have BME leaders, chief executives, men, women, etc. The reality is it becomes more complex then, both for the wider community and the community they serve, if that leader then happens to be part of the LGBT group and how people react to that person. Do people actually want that person to be seen as their leader? So I think it's a lot more complex, and I think the actual structure in terms of how it's actually kind of set up the voluntary sector, one of the things I think that we're very good at is that we're very good at kind of making change and making it happen. But if we were actually working kind of in business where you actually had the money and time needed, I think we can progress this a lot more. I think far too often, unfortunately, the black chief executives I've actually met, their stories are very, very similar to mine. However, a lot of white chief executives I meet have basically gone from university to maybe some project management to some consultancy, and then they're actually a leader of an organization. And the organization they lead often is actually working in a diverse area that they don't live in and they don't actually understand. That's not the case all the time, but I do think that it's really, really important when we talk about this collaborative work and what people bring to the table, is that even if somebody doesn't actually bring a first-class degree to the table, the experience, the grassroots experience they've actually have as a woman, as a disabled person, as LBGT or whatever, I think all that actually counts to them being a tremendously positive leader and bringing about change in their communities. I don't know if you've got anything to say, Gilly.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think we have to work very hard to try and make sure that we engage the diversity within within the BAME communities, and actually that intersectionality. It can be very easy to marginalise within any particular community, and so I think that the point that Joseph makes about really understanding the different experiences that people bring and how that shapes services, organisations and stuff. But it's about, again, it's about going out and finding and making sure those voices are heard, because so often the doors, I think, are closed.
Thank you very much. I think we could go on for another hour, but obviously we only have an hour and it's nearly up. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn to my colleague Steve, who is going to sum up the webinar, and thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Fedilis. So we've got 2 minutes left, I think. So I just want to start by thanking all our contributors, including you in the audience who have asked questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get the opportunity to reiterate all those questions, but we have taken careful note, and they will help us think through how we think about developing leadership in this particular or for this particular community. So just suffice to say that leadership development is certainly complex in and of itself, and it doesn't get any less complex when we begin to think about the specific challenges that the BAME community is facing. So you, the speakers and the questions that you in the audience have asked has given us a lot of food for thought. We certainly need to carry on working collaboratively with the community in order to think about what we in CVSL can do to address this. But we will certainly try to do that. So thank you, everybody, for your participation today.